The heat of the Alabama sun in the summer of 1852 was not a warmth that nourished. It was a smothering weight, thick with the scent of stagnant water and decaying leaves. It pressed down on everything, on the cotton fields baking under the relentless sky, on the sprawling, wealthy plantations that defined the landscape of human bondage, and most heavily of all, on the vast, liquid, terrifying wilderness that lay west of the Mobile River. This place, a labyrinth of cypress knees and black water, was known simply as the Big Swamp. It was where the rules of man bent and often broke, and it was here that one of the most unbelievable, bloody, and defining ghost stories of the antebellum South began, not with a spirit, but with a man named Cain. 31 men, 31 armed hunters, bounty men, and professional trackers, each hardened by years of chasing runaways and each believing implicitly in his own superiority. They were seasoned in violence, armed with the latest repeating rifles and hounds, bred for relentless pursuit. They moved with the certainty of men performing a necessary, profitable, and sanctioned duty. Their target was a single fugitive, a man stripped of everything but the tattered clothes on his back and the burning, deep knowledge of the swamp. Yet when the tale of this pursuit was finally whispered years later, a whisper usually confined to the darkest corners of forgotten taverns, far from respectable ears, it was not the sheer number of the hunters that drew the shiver. It was the absolute, horrific finality of their encounter. All 31 went in, none came out, and the official, terrifying moniker given to the man who achieved this impossible feat was the Swamp Reaper. The very idea defied logic, the rules of weaponry, and the laws of probability. 31 against 1. It should have been a brief, brutal, one-sided affair, a simple footnote in the ledger of lost property and recovered bounties. But what happened deep within that primordial soup of water and mud was not a hunt. It was an extermination, meticulously planned and executed by a mind driven past the breaking point. It was the moment a fugitive slave stopped running and decided to become the absolute, terrifying master of the maze he inhabited. He did not seek to escape them, he sought to bury them. To understand the sheer magnitude of this conflict, we must first understand the ground upon which it was fought and the era that defined it. The year 1852 sat squarely in the middle of a time when the institution of slavery was at its most aggressive and economically vital peak. Alabama was a furnace of commerce powered by human labor. To run away was not just a crime, it was an economic assault on the foundations of Southern society. When Cain fled, he was not just leaving a plantation, he was shattering the illusion of control held by the powerful men who owned the land, the crops, and the courts. Cain's conflict began not in the woods, but in the glaring midday sun of the plantation yard, several miles inland from the swamp's edge. He was a field hand, physically imposing, but usually quiet and stoic, carrying the burdens placed upon him with the heavy silence typical of those without voice. The spark that ignited the whole tragedy was not his own escape, but a desperate final defense of another. A woman, whose identity is now lost to the annals of history, had been cornered by the plantation's most cruel and notorious overseer. A man known simply as Silas, whose brutality was only matched by his arrogance. When Silas raised a whip for what would have been the final fatal blow, Cain moved. It was a swift, overwhelming act of protection. The tool Cain used was simple, a broken hoe handle, hardened by dirt and sweat. But the force of his blow was final. The overseer collapsed, his skull fractured dead before he hit the dusty ground. The sound that followed was the ringing silence of pure terror and realization. Cain did not wait for the inevitable wave of retribution. He knew that the killing of a white overseer, regardless of the justification, meant only one thing: torture followed by a slow, public death. He did not look back. He ran toward the only place where the law of the plantation held no dominion: the swamp. The immediate alarm raised was deafening. The killing of Silas was not just a crime, it was an insult to the entire system. Planters from neighboring counties immediately pooled their resources, demanding swift, exemplary justice. They did not hire the local sheriff, who might be slow or inefficient. They called in the best, the most merciless, the group of seasoned bounty hunters led by a man named Elias Kincaid. Elias Kincaid was the epitome of the professional hunter. He was lean, sharp-eyed, and utterly devoid of pity. His reputation was built on his chilling efficiency. He never lost a quarry, dead or alive. He assembled his team, 30 men besides himself. Each one promised a significant share of the bounty, and more importantly, the thrill of the chase and the certainty of the kill. They were armed with Ballard rifles, sturdy pistols, long knives, and an unwarranted sense of invincibility. 31 men, each expecting a profitable day trip into the wild. The conflict was thus set. On one side, organization, overwhelming firepower, experience in pursuit, and the full authority of the law, backed by the wealth of the planting class. On the other, one exhausted, terrified, but rapidly calculating man, Cain, plunging headlong into the darkest corner of the natural world. The first few hours of the pursuit were characterized by the hunter's arrogance. They followed the tracks easily, deep boot prints mixing with the desperate barefoot scuff marks of the fugitive. Kincaid assumed Cain was running blindly, driven by panic, seeking to reach the coast or perhaps a distant northern state. But the swamp is a master of disguise. It swallowed the sun, replacing light with gloom and heat with suffocating humidity. Cain, however, was not blinded by panic. He was adapting. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of this environment, witnessing its moods, understanding its deadly patterns. He knew the water moccasins that rested on the low-hanging branches, the exact depth of the deceptive quicksand holes, and the way the cypress roots formed tripwires and hiding places. While Kincaid and his men viewed the swamp as an obstacle to be traversed, Cain viewed it as a fortress to be utilized. The first subtle warning came on the morning of the second day, about 5 miles deep into the tangle where the water grew truly black. Kincaid's prize dog, a massive bloodhound named Brute, stopped suddenly, whimpering, its nose twitching frantically not toward Cain's scent, but toward something else, a disturbance in the water. One of the younger, more reckless hunters, a boy named Jed, pushed the dog aside, muttering about cowardice. He stepped onto what he thought was a solid patch of earth, only to find it was a thin layer of floating moss disguising a deep sinkhole. He went down instantly, a gurgling cry cut short as the black water closed over his head. The hunters reacted with fury, spending precious, hot minutes pulling the heavy, lifeless body from the hole. Kincaid, however, felt a thin thread of unease. The sinkhole was not accidental. There were subtle, almost invisible signs that the moss had been specifically laid back down, creating a deadly, perfect trap. They had lost 1 man, making the total 29 remaining, but they dismissed it as bad luck, a hazard of the terrain. Cain, they reasoned, was too busy running for his life to be setting traps. They were wrong. Cain was no longer running, he was preparing the ground for war. As they progressed, the pursuit slowed from a confident march to a wary crawl. The dense cypress and gum trees blocked the light, creating eternal twilight. The sounds of their own movements, the snapping of twigs, the slosh of their heavy boots, were amplified, masking any sign of their prey. The swamp was teaching them humility, forcing them to spend hours hacking through vines and maneuvering around sloughs filled with unseen threats. Cain, meanwhile, was utilizing the ancient knowledge passed down through generations of those who lived and died close to the land. Knowledge of snares, deadfalls, and silent transit. He wasn't using a rifle. He was using the swamp itself as his weapon. Every bending branch, every carefully wedged rock, every patch of slippery mud was being scrutinized, modified, and weaponized. The true chilling nature of the man they hunted began to dawn on Kincaid when they found the campfire. It was small, perfectly concealed beneath an overhang of heavy moss, and already cold. The arrangement of the stones suggested a practiced hand, someone trying to minimize smoke and maximize heat. But next to the cold ashes, there was a meticulous drawing scratched into a piece of slate rock, a crudely drawn stick figure representing Kincaid, marked with a perfect, clean X across the chest. This was not the desperate scrawling of a terrified animal. This was the work of someone who had stopped fearing and had started hunting. It was a direct, chilling message. They were no longer the predators. They were the invited prey. Kincaid gathered his remaining 29 men. The arrogance was gone, replaced by sweaty, anxious caution. "Listen up," he hissed, his voice raw from the humidity. "This man knows this swamp better than we know our own homes, but he is still just one man. We scatter, we find him, and we take him down quick before he can play any more damned games." They should never have scattered. Their numerical advantage was their only real protection, the only thing that kept the lurking terrors of the swamp at bay. But the message had worked. Cain had successfully interrupted their pattern of thought, replacing their belief in a swift victory with the gnawing fear of the unknown. They split into 3 groups, 29 men fragmenting their strength across a hostile, vast territory. This act of tactical desperation was exactly what the Swamp Reaper had been waiting for. Cain was observing them from a high, thick growth of kudzu vine woven among the branches. He had been tracking them easily, not by their footprints, which the water quickly erased, but by their noise, their smell, and their overwhelming sense of certainty. He saw the 3 groups drift apart, their lines of sight broken by the dense foliage. He knew that the moment of direct confrontation was still too risky. He needed to thin the herd, to chip away at their numbers until the fear of one another outweighed their lust for the bounty. He moved like water flowing around stones, silent and impossibly fast. He didn't rely on a gun, for the sound of a gunshot would betray his position and bring the entire force down upon him. Instead, he relied on tools he crafted in the darkest hours. Sharpened lengths of bone, tough wire salvaged from an old trapline, and the immense, crushing weight of the swamp itself. The first group Cain targeted consisted of 8 men, led by a heavy-set tracker named Amos. Amos was focused on the ground, his eyes darting for fresh tracks, oblivious to the high canopy above. Cain had spent the morning preparing a massive, unstable deadfall, a collection of waterlogged logs and stones balanced precariously on a thin vine taut across 2 high branches. As Amos and his men passed directly beneath the setup, Cain severed the vine with one silent, precise swing of his makeshift bone knife. The sound was a horrific, dull crack, followed by the wet, sickening impact of tons of rotten wood and stone crashing down. The debris swallowed 4 men instantly, crushing them into the mud with a finality that left no doubt of their demise. The remaining 4 scattered, screaming, lost in a sudden, blinding terror. The silence that followed the crash was perhaps the most frightening sound of all. It was the sound of the swamp reasserting itself, absorbing the violence and closing in on the living. Kincaid, hearing the faint but unmistakable chaos from a distance, felt the chilling realization bloom in his chest. They were being hunted, and the number of armed men pursuing a lone fugitive had just dropped from 29 to 25, with 4 already absorbed by the indifferent mud of the Alabama swamp. This was not a pursuit, it was a reckoning, and the Swamp Reaper had just started collecting his dues. The terror had taken root. The hunters had entered the black water labyrinth believing in gold and glory. They were now learning that the currency of the swamp was far more gruesome, paid not in dollars, but in blood, sweat, and screaming anxiety. Cain had done more than just kill 4 men. He had shattered the confidence of the remaining 24, turning their collective strength into isolated, vulnerable fear. The stage was set. The hunter was hunted. And the next few hours would define the legend of the most effective, terrifying fugitive the Deep South had ever known. The impossibility of 31 falling to one man had taken its terrifying first step toward reality. The remaining hunters were now separated, terrified, and utterly disoriented, trapped in the domain of the master. Elias Kincaid felt the cold realization settle like a snake around his heart. He was not pursuing a man who fled. He was facing a man who fought, who utilized the land like a sentient, vengeful god. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the night in the swamp was not merely dark, it was absolute auditory blackness, broken only by the thousand sounds of the deadly world around them, all of which now sounded like the silent approach of the swamp reaper. The first day had ended with a clear message. Cain was not just surviving, he was waiting, and tomorrow the real killing would begin. To be continued in part 2, where the methodical elimination of the remaining hunters unfolds across the black heart of the Alabama swamp. The mud of the Alabama Delta was not earth. It was a hungry, sucking maw that clung to the boots, pulling the men down into the dense, root-tangled darkness. The initial pursuit, a band of 23 heavily armed bounty hunters and plantation overseers, had begun with the easy confidence of men who believed they were tracking a beast, a frightened runaway slave fleeing justice. That confidence had evaporated somewhere between the discovery of the third and the seventh body. What they found in the cypress break was not the haphazard violence of desperation, but a chilling efficiency. The first few victims, stout men named Silas and Bart, were discovered leaning against trees, their heavy, oiled rifles still clutched in their hands, their eyes wide open to the sluggish grey sky. There was no sign of struggle, no widespread blood spatter, only a single precise entry wound. The Reaper, as he was now whispered to be, was not using a traditional scatter gun or even a simple powder pistol. The wounds suggested a heavy caliber, maybe a prized Kentucky long rifle, wielded by someone who understood the lethal mechanics of ballistics better than any militiaman they knew. This was the first great shock. The realization that the man they hunted was a master marksman, operating in terrain where visibility rarely exceeded 20 feet. How could a fugitive recently escaped from the fields possess such skill, such weaponry, and such profound calm? The hunting party, now fragmented and tense, retreated to higher ground, huddling around a crackling fire that did little to ward off the oppressive humidity or the buzzing cloud of mosquitoes. They had started the chase with 23 men. In 48 hours, 5 were dead, and 2 others, panicked by the eerie silence between the strikes, had simply vanished back towards the civilization they craved, abandoning their share of the reward. They knew the risk of leaving the posse, the shame of returning empty-handed, but the terror of remaining in that swamp was a weight too heavy for their souls. The leader of the group, a grim-faced man named Captain Sterling, whose reputation was built on years of tracking runaways, felt the brittle edge of his authority crumbling. He had seen fugitives before, scared, often starved, driven by desperation. This man was different. This fugitive was tracking them. Sterling looked at the tangled, dark water, reflecting the stunted Spanish moss-draped trees. The swamp was a living, breathing entity, but to the hunters it felt like the extended cloak of their enemy. Every patch of shifting fog, every cry of a heron, every unexpected splash in the distance sounded like the prelude to a fatal shot. They were no longer the predators. They were the bait, drawn deeper into the killer's larder. The deeper they ventured, the more the natural hazards conspired against them, almost as if guided by an unseen hand. The quicksand pits, hidden beneath deceptive layers of dark foliage, seemed to be exactly where they stepped when they sought to avoid particularly rough patches of cypress knees. The water moccasins, usually shy and retiring, struck with unusual aggression. They soon realized the simple truth that offered little comfort. The Reaper knew this land with an intimacy they could never grasp. He hadn't just escaped into the swamp. He was born of it, or perhaps had been forged within its depths over long, silent years. Rumors began to circulate among the remaining 16 men, whispered low around the dying embers. They tried to piece together who this fugitive might be. Was he the runaway, known only as Josiah, who supposedly possessed uncanny bushcraft skills learned before he was brought south? Or perhaps he was not a recent escapee at all, but a free man who had long sheltered in the forgotten islands of the interior, waiting for the opportunity to strike back against the slave patrols and the men who upheld the system. The most disturbing theory, the one that Sterling ruthlessly suppressed, was that the Reaper was a man named Cato, a former enslaved carpenter and trapper who had spent 2 decades working the river ferries, learning every current, every hidden creek, every soft spot of the delta. Cato had disappeared 5 years prior, following a brutal flogging that had left him permanently damaged. If it was Cato, then this was not a matter of catching a frightened animal. This was a war against a calculating and vengeful ghost. The pattern of the attack soon shifted, escalating the psychological torment. The Reaper stopped killing at random. He began targeting the most valuable assets of the posse. First went the tracking dogs, 2 magnificent bloodhounds worth a significant sum. They were found drowned silently in a hidden pool, their leashes cut neatly. Then, the supplies. One evening, they awoke to find their single remaining powder keg soaked through with muddy swamp water, rendering the powder useless until dried, a process that would take days under the oppressive damp. It was not a grand confrontation. It was a steady, suffocating attrition designed to starve and disarm them. The men started drinking the rough corn whiskey they carried, seeking dullness against the sharp edge of fear. Arguments broke out over who was standing watch correctly, who was making too much noise, and who was secretly planning to turn tail. The discipline Captain Sterling had tried to enforce dissolved into paranoia. This was the Reaper's true genius, understanding that the strongest weapon against these hunters was not a bullet, but the disintegration of their shared sanity. He was hunting not just their bodies, but their minds. They attempted a counter-tactic, spreading out, covering more ground, hoping to flank him. It was a fatal mistake. 3 men, a young apprentice overseer named Davies and 2 experienced trackers named Harris and Boone, were delegated to circle wide, establishing a perimeter. By noon, Harris was found pinned beneath a massive rotten log, which had evidently been propped in a precariously balanced position and triggered by a tripwire, a classic trapper's maneuver, adapted for lethal force. He wasn't dead from the blow, but grievously wounded, his lower torso crushed. The Reaper hadn't killed him immediately. Instead, he had left him there, moaning, unable to move, a horrifying beacon for the returning posse. When Sterling and the others found Harris, they were already exhausted, sweating heavily under the humid sun. They tried to move the log, a desperate, futile effort. It was too heavy and the ground too unstable. As they struggled, they heard the sharp, unmistakable crack of the heavy rifle, echoing off the dense trees. Davies dropped, struck squarely in the throat. The sound had come from an impossible distance, perhaps 70 yards away, through a wall of foliage thick enough to stop a musket ball. The Reaper hadn't just maimed Harris to draw them in. He had used the victim's cries as auditory bait, focusing their attention while he found his sightline through the leaves. Boone, seeing the horror, panicked. He threw down his rifle and plunged headlong into a deep patch of murky water, attempting to swim to the distant bank. The Reaper did not waste a bullet on him. Boone was never seen again. Whether the deep mud claimed him, or a waiting alligator, or the Reaper finished him silently in the water, the result was the same. 3 more men gone. The count now stood at 10 dead or missing. Of the original 23, only 13 remained, and they were profoundly demoralized, their faces etched with fever and fear. They had spent days in the swamp and had not even glimpsed their quarry. All they had were the terrifying results of his invisible presence. Sterling knew the political implications of this failure. The reward for the Reaper had already doubled, drawing in men from neighboring counties, men greedy enough to enter the deadly swamp, but perhaps too inexperienced for the horror that awaited them. More hunters meant more guns, but it also meant more noise, more incompetence, and more targets for the Swamp Reaper. It was during the night following the death of Davies that the true scale of the Reaper's tactical superiority became agonizingly clear. Sterling's group had been forced to abandon their heavy baggage and retreat to a small, isolated ridge, a temporary refuge known locally as Serpent's Mound. As they tried to rest, one of the men, a taciturn tracker named Fisk, pointed silently toward the dark trees across the sluggish stream. They saw it. Small, faint, flickering lights. Not fireflies, but lanterns. A new group of hunters had arrived, lured by the promise of the bounty. There were perhaps 8 or 9 new lamps moving slowly through the gloom, heading directly toward the sound of the previous day's struggle. Sterling tried to signal them, to warn them back, but the fear of drawing the Reaper's attention kept his voice trapped in his throat. They watched in agonizing silence as the new arrivals, green men, loud and confident, moved into the very trap Sterling's group had just escaped. A shout of surprise pierced the silence, followed by a confused splash. Then a volley of disorganized gunfire erupted. It was a chaotic spray, not focused, not aimed. The sound was instantly swallowed by the dense atmosphere. Then, silence again. A profound, absolute silence that was heavier than the gunfire had been. When the sun broke over the eastern canopy, bathing the ridge in a sickly green light, Sterling led a small reconnaissance party toward the area where the fresh hunters had camped. What they found cemented the legend of the Swamp Reaper forever in their minds. The newcomers were dead, every one of them. They had not been killed by slow attrition or subtle traps. This time, the Reaper had engaged in open battle, and he had done so with devastating speed and precision. One man, likely the leader, was found with 3 distinct wounds, each placed in rapid succession, one to the knee, crippling him, one to the shoulder, disarming him, and the final fatal shot to the head. It suggested a rapid reload technique, or perhaps 2 weapons, wielded with staggering proficiency. But the most chilling detail was the arrangement of the bodies. The Reaper had taken the time to lay out the rifles of the slain hunters, 8 expensive firearms, in a neat, terrifying row at the base of a massive cypress tree, and pinned to the tree above them with a long hunting knife was a piece of cheap cloth. It was the bloodied shirt of one of Sterling's earlier victims. It was a declaration, a pattern interrupt designed to communicate one singular message. I am armed with your folly, and I will use your own tools against you. The new group was comprised of 9 men. Added to Sterling's existing losses, the total stood at 19 casualties. 19 armed men had fallen to the single invisible force. Sterling's remaining men looked at the organized line of rifles and the chilling banner of the bloodied shirt, and they did not see a man. They saw the embodiment of the swamp's ancient dark soul. The sheer audacity of the attack, eliminating 9 men in a single confined burst and then taking the time to arrange the scene, told Sterling that retreat was no longer an option. The Reaper was not merely defending himself or seeking freedom, he was executing a calculated vendetta, and the swamp had become his chosen battlefield. The goal was total elimination. They gathered the usable rifles, heavy, unfamiliar burdens, and began the grim, necessary work of burying the dead hastily in the unstable, watery ground. They had to move. Staying put meant waiting for the next strike. Moving meant plunging deeper into the very heart of the Reaper's domain. They were caught between the hammer and the anvil, between the terror of immobility and the deadly labyrinth of the Delta. Sterling, clutching his own sweating rifle, felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had started this hunt with the promise of glory and gold. He was now fighting solely for survival. He understood that the fugitive had evolved from a runaway into a symbol, a devastating counterpoint to the arrogance of the men who believed they owned the land and the people on it. This was the moment where the pursuit officially ended and the struggle for escape began. The Reaper had closed the door behind them, and now they were his prey, awaiting the final, inevitable tally. The chilling question remained. If the Reaper could defeat a party of 9 so efficiently, what precise horrors awaited the 13 survivors still trapped deep within the ancient, dripping cathedral of the Alabama swamp? Their ordeal was far from over. It had only escalated into a focused, targeted massacre, driving them toward the final confrontation that neither side could survive intact. The scent of death, thick and metallic, hung heavy in the warm, stagnant air, promising a devastating conclusion still to come. The air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity and the decay of ages. This was the final foray, the last, desperate cast of the net. They called themselves the Iron 12, the hardest men the county could muster, led by Major Thorne, a veteran of the Creek Wars, a man who believed that fear was a tool, not an emotion. He had seen death before. He simply refused to believe that a single fugitive could master 31 of his peers without the aid of true sorcery. But the swamp does not deal in sorcery. It deals in truth, hard and unforgiving. Major Thorne tightened the leather strap of his rifle, the metal slick with sweat. They were deep now, further than any previous hunting party dared to venture, into the territory known only as the Viper's Coil, a labyrinth of cypress knees and stagnant pools where the sun never quite reached the ground. The mud here was not simply wet. It was grasping, eager to suck the boots from the feet and hold the unwary until the insects finished their work. Thorne surveyed his remaining men. 12 they were, reduced to 9 by the time the sun crossed the meridian. Not by direct engagement, but by the quiet, unsettling attrition that had characterized this entire ordeal. One man, Peterson, vanished silently while checking a perimeter. They found his rifle leaning against a tree, his knife sheathed, but the man himself gone, leaving behind only a faint impression in the slick green algae near the water's edge. Another, Old Man Jenkins, was found 20 yards later, impaled by a sharpened stake hidden beneath the dark water. A precise, calculated trap designed not merely to kill, but to terrify the survivors. The Reaper, this spectral figure, did not hunt like a man. He hunted like the swamp itself. He was the fever, the sudden drop into a sinkhole, the coil of the cottonmouth waiting where the foot was about to land. Thorne forced himself to swallow the rising tide of panic. They had to push forward. The goal was a small, dry hammock rumored to be the Reaper's sanctuary, a tiny island barely visible on the crudest local maps. If the stories whispered in the slave quarters were true, stories that had traveled miles and fueled the fugitive's legend, this man, whose real name was forgotten by most, had a reason beyond simple survival. He was settling an old score, a debt of blood rooted firmly in the cruelties endemic to the system of human bondage that stained the South. As the sun began its slow, agonizing decline, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like mocking spirits through the moss, they heard it, a sound that was not natural to the swamp. A single, distinct tap, like metal striking bone, followed by an immediate choked cry. Major Thorne froze, his hand raised. He counted heads, 8 left. He ordered them into a defensive square, back to back, breathing the fetid air, their eyes darting into the impenetrable darkness just beyond the reach of their sight. The silence that followed was immense, heavy enough to crush the lungs. "Hold fast, damn you!" Thorne hissed, his voice barely audible over the relentless buzz of the mosquitoes. A moment later, they heard the rustle. Not the usual stir of an alligator or the splash of a frog, but the slow, deliberate movement of something heavy being dragged across the wet ground. It circled them, always remaining just outside the range of their lamps. Suddenly, a voice broke the tension, deep, resonant, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was English, but rough, seasoned by years without civilized discourse. "The 32 shall be the number of the payment," the voice echoed, seemingly coming from the cypress roots, the water, and the very air. "You came for justice. Justice finds you now." This was the first time any hunter had heard the Reaper speak. It shattered the illusion of him being a voiceless phantom. He was a man, deliberate and terrifyingly sane. The attack, when it came, was not a charge. It was a withdrawal. 3 men on the southern flank suddenly dropped their weapons and began screaming, not from pain, but from blinding, instantaneous agony. The Swamp Reaper had not attacked them with a knife or a bullet. He had used the swamp itself. He had dug shallow pits and filled them with a slurry concocted from rotted swamp vegetation, mixed with powerful local toxins. A venomous mud drawn from rare fungi and specific plants known only to those who lived and died in the wild. The men were thrashing, clawing at their faces as their eyes swelled shut, their skin already blistering violently. Thorn realized the terrifying truth. The Reaper was not a fighting man relying on physical strength. He was a chemist, a botanist, a master engineer of natural destruction. He used the abundance of the swamp as his arsenal. "Fire! Scatter the darkness! Shoot where the voice came from!" Thorn roared, but the sound of the rifles was muffled by the suffocating atmosphere. 2 more men panicked and broke the circle, running blindly toward what they hoped was drier land. They lasted less than 10 seconds. One was snagged by a heavy, concealed rope trap that yanked him upside down, his head cracking against a cypress root with sickening finality. The other simply disappeared into a camouflaged pit designed to be deep and narrow, a grave dug specifically for a single man. Thorn was left with just 2 loyal men, and the chilling realization that the Swamp Reaper was playing with them, herding them toward a location of his choosing. They were not the hunters. They were the prey being driven to the slaughterhouse. They stumbled upon the hammock. It was a slight rise of land, crowned by enormous ancient oaks, the roots creating natural defenses. They collapsed onto the relatively dry earth, gasping, their nerves frayed to breaking points. "He's not here," whispered one of the remaining men, Sergeant Healy, peering nervously into the shadows. "He wants us here. Why?" Thorn raised his lamp, its flickering light illuminating the small circular clearing. The hammock was strangely tidy, considering its isolation. And then they saw the artifacts. There, resting on a carved piece of cedar wood, were several small, carefully smoothed stones, painted with crude but recognizable portraits. A woman, 2 small children. Beside the stones lay a tarnished wedding ring and a collar, a heavy iron slave collar, broken cleanly in the middle, the metal scoring clearly visible. The scene pulsed with silent sorrow. This was not the lair of a monster, but a memorial. "My God," Healy breathed. He was avenging his family. The story, previously dismissed as morbid folklore, was suddenly sharp and immediate. The Swamp Reaper years ago had been Silas, a field hand known for his gentle strength and his uncanny ability to heal the wounds of the livestock. His wife and children had been sold off to different plantations downriver, a common callous act of commerce in 1850s Alabama, but one that broke something essential in Silas. When he tried to run after them, he was caught, beaten, and locked in the stocks. He escaped, not through brute force, but through patience and knowledge, knowing which local insects could chew through dry rope, knowing how the tides of the nearby river could be used for camouflage. The Reaper's trail of victims, Thorn realized, was not random. 31 hunters, 31 men tied directly or indirectly to the network that profited from human misery, men who had participated in the sales, the beatings, the enforcement of the system that ripped Silas's life apart. The final men remaining, including Thorn, were the very captains and controllers of that brutal trade. A shadow detached itself from the immense trunk of the largest oak. He was not large, this man, perhaps average height, but his frame was wiry, hardened like cured leather. He wore little more than ragged, dark burlap soaked in mud, making him almost invisible against the backdrop. His eyes, though, were what commanded attention. They were ancient, burning with an unquenchable, quiet fury. He held no rifle, In his hand, he held a simple, heavy machete, its blade worn thin from years of use, sharpened to a surgical edge. This was the climax, the moment of reckoning between the established order and the vengeance it had unwittingly cultivated in the deepest, darkest corners of the earth. "Major Thorn," the Reaper said, his voice quiet now, devoid of echo, just pure, contained menace. "Your name was the final name on the list the Overseer kept." Thorn gripped his rifle, his hands shaking despite his training. "Silas, it ends here. Drop the blade." "It ended many seasons ago, Major, when you approved the papers that sent my little girl south to New Orleans. You signed the end of my life, but you forgot that the swamp signs nothing but death." Healy, the surviving sergeant, lifted his own rifle and fired immediately. The shot ripped through the stillness, but the Reaper was gone. Not fast enough to be supernatural, but fast enough to exploit the human eye's natural delay in low light. He had dropped to the ground the very instant the trigger was pulled, rolling into a depression between two roots, coated in the very mud he had used as poison. Healy screamed as something tore into his lower leg. The Reaper had launched himself forward, using the brief moment of the gun flash as a shield, slicing Healy's Achilles tendon. The sergeant collapsed, his body immediately falling prey to the blinding toxic mud spread liberally around the clearing's perimeter. Now it was just Thorn and the Reaper. The Major, realizing the futility of shooting, drew his heavy military saber, the polished steel glinting briefly before the light failed completely as the lamp was snuffed out by a sudden, precise spray of water. The Reaper spitting water with force and accuracy, extinguishing the last artificial illumination. Total darkness fell, broken only by the rasping breaths of the two men and the distant, constant hum of the insect choir. Thorn was a fighter, heavy and strong, trained for open combat. The Reaper was a dancer, light and fluid, trained by the needs of survival and the endless, twisting paths of the swamp. Thorn lashed out with the saber, swinging wide. He hit only air, the heavy blade sinking harmlessly into the soft earth. He heard the rush of wind beside his ear, then the excruciating white-hot pain as the machete sliced across his shoulder, cutting deep into muscle and bone. Thorn bellowed, dropping his saber, his rifle, everything clutching the wound. He stumbled backward, falling to his knees beside the cedar altar where the painted stones lay. He realized he was defeated,